Two cars touch at the entry to Les Combs at Spa. Same corner, same braking zone, same racing weekend. One driver gets a 5-second penalty, the other gets nothing at all. That is Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. And the gap between those two rulings is now the reason every driver on the grid is walking into a room with the FIA in Budapest this weekend. Because when the stewards explained themselves, they used two different rulebooks, and one of those explanations does not survive contact with the sporting code. If you had asked anyone standing in the Spa-Francorchamps paddock on Sunday evening whether this one fades by the time the trucks reach Hungary, almost all of them tell you yes. Cars touch, verdicts get argued about for a day, the paddock empties, and the sport moves on to the next circuit. Normally that is the entire life cycle of a steward's decision in Formula 1. This one is not following it. The drivers are sitting down with the FIA over the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, and both Spa incidents are on the table when they do. That is what has been reported this week, and it turns a race day argument into something with a room, a date, and a set of people who have to answer for it. What makes that awkward for the governing body is the timing. The meeting was already in the diary before the Belgian Grand Prix ever ran. It exists because of a promise made at the end of last season, when the drivers and the FIA agreed to stop leaving these conversations until December and start holding one in the middle of the year as well. So the room was booked, the agenda was open, and then Spa handed the grid the two cleanest examples of inconsistency anyone has produced all season. Nobody planned that, it just landed. And the drivers are walking in with something they have not had in a long time, which is two decisions from the same corner at the same event that appear to point in opposite directions. Not a feeling, not a vibe about the stewards being harsh. Two documents, published by the same officials, sitting side by side. Documents are a much harder thing to wave away. Start with the one that got no punishment at all. Lap 8 of 44, and Leclerc is defending third place from Oscar Piastri down the Kemmel Straight. The long uphill run that turns Spa into a slipstreaming shooting gallery. Piastri gets alongside on the outside. The two cars arrive at the braking zone for Les Combs side by side. Leclerc moves left toward the racing line, and the left rear of the Ferrari meets the front right of the McLaren. Wheels touch. Piastri runs wide across the curb. A piece of the McLaren floor is torn away. The stewards look at it and close the file with no further action and no penalty points. Leclerc finishes second, Piastri finishes fifth. Now rewind to lap 1, exact same stretch of tarmac. Hamilton outdrags Russell up the Kemmel Straight and takes the inside line into Les Combs. Russell commits to the outside. Hamilton's front left makes contact with the right-hand side of the Mercedes. Russell is spun into the gravel trap, and his race ends there and then. The stewards look at that one too. 5-second time penalty, cut down from the standard 10 because they accept there were mitigating circumstances. No penalty points on the license. Hamilton serves it under the virtual safety car at his pit stop and comes home fourth. Same corner, same weekend, same officials. One driver walks away clean, one driver gets a sanction on a lap where nobody had space to breathe. If you are wondering how both of those can be true at once, so is everyone on the grid. And the reason this bites harder than the usual stewards argument is that the outcomes are not symmetrical. Russell leaves Spa with nothing at all, his car parked in the gravel before the field has completed a full lap. Hamilton takes his punishment and still banks a fourth place. Piastri loses ground on track to the exact driver he was trying to pass, and watches him collect a podium. In a championship season, the officiating is not an abstract argument about fairness. It is a mechanism that hands points to one driver and removes them from another. And this weekend, it did both in the space of 8 laps at the same corner. That is why the grid is not letting it go. The Leclerc document is where the argument really starts, because of what the stewards chose to measure. Their reasoning says that Piastri had achieved some overlap, but that his front axle was not ahead of the front axle of the Ferrari. From that position, in their view, there was no realistic possibility of Piastri completing the pass. They also say Leclerc did not deliberately force his rival off the edge of the track, and that he was simply following the normal racing line before the corner entry, moving slightly left to open the corner up. Read that again in plain terms. The Ferrari moved across, the two cars touched, and the ruling turns on where one front axle sat relative to the other. Follow that logic forward, and it reshapes every outside move in the sport. If the defending driver is entitled to take his line whenever the attacking car has not pulled its front axle ahead, then the outside lane at a high-speed braking zone stops being an overtaking option and becomes a place you get pushed out of legally. Piastri had overlap. The stewards say so themselves in the ruling. Overlap was simply not enough to buy him any protection, which means the next driver who tries the outside at Les Combs, or anywhere else with a fast entry, is doing it knowing the rulebook has been read this way in public. That is not a Ferrari problem or a McLaren problem. That is a precedent problem. Piastri does not accept it, and he has not gone quiet about it either. His account is that he was already on the white line at the edge of the circuit and got squeezed anyway, that the two of them touched wheels at the start of the braking zone, and that both of them were lucky the contact stayed small. Then the line that lands hardest. He says he does not really know where he was supposed to go. There is the whole complaint, compressed into 9 words. Not a demand for a race ban, not an accusation of dirty driving. A driver saying that he followed the rules as he understands them, ran out of road anyway, and cannot work out what the correct alternative was supposed to be. He goes further, and this is the part that matters for Budapest. Nobody is insisting it needed to be a penalty. His position is that, at minimum, it warranted a black and white flag, the warning tool the stewards have for exactly this kind of thing, and he warns that letting it pass with nothing teaches every driver on the grid a lesson. If you can squeeze somebody to the paint and face no consequence, then leaving your rival the absolute bare minimum space becomes the smart move rather than the risky one. The damage bill backs him up. The contact tears at the McLaren floor, and the team put the cost at somewhere between 2 and 3/10 of a second per lap. That is not cosmetic. Losing that much downforce means pushing the tyres harder to hold the same pace, which speeds up degradation, which compounds across a stint. Piastri fights the rest of the afternoon in a car that is quietly worse than the one he started in, and he finishes 5th while the driver he was passing stands on the podium in 2nd. Andrea Stella is measured about it in public, which somehow makes it heavier. The McLaren boss says he wants to read the reasoning properly, and asks whether the deciding factor really is the relative position of Oscar's front axle against Leclerc's car. Then he makes the safety argument. When 2 cars run alongside each other for that long, the one defending the inside has to leave enough room, because contact that nobody controls at that part of Spa does not stay small. Martin Brundle, watching from the commentary box, sees a clear movement in the braking zone, the kind of thing the guidelines cover with everything from a warning flag up to a drive-through penalty. He also points at Leclerc's reaction in the cool-down room afterwards as telling its own story. That latter is worth understanding, because it explains why Piastri sounds as frustrated as he does. The stewards are not stuck choosing between doing nothing and ending somebody's race. They have a black and white flag for a warning. Time penalties of 5 and 10 seconds sit above that. Penalty points accumulate on a license across a whole year. Higher still come grid drops for the following event, and at the top of the ladder, the drive-through. Every rung was available at Spa. They used none of them, not the smallest one, not the symbolic one. A driver reported floor damage, wheel contact at the entry to a braking zone, and nowhere left to go, and the file closed with no further action written on it. But the grid is not finished. Not even close, because the second half of this argument comes from the people who were punished, and they are saying the same thing in reverse. Hamilton's verdict runs on completely different machinery. The stewards accept that he experienced understeer through the corner, that he applied corrective steering to try to avoid the Mercedes, and that the loss of front grip came from turbulent air off the Red Bull of Max Verstappen running ahead of him. They accept he knew Russell was there. They accept he tried to leave appropriate racing room. Nothing in their own account reads as aggressive or deliberate, and they penalise him anyway, on the finding that Russell stayed within the available racing room, and that Hamilton failed to keep enough separation. Wholly at fault, in their words, with several mitigating circumstances applied to soften the number. The arithmetic inside that decision is the strangest part of it. Causing a collision normally carries 10 seconds. The stewards cut it in half, and they cut it in half because they accepted his account of every single thing that happened. He knew where Russell was, room got left for him, and a correction went in on the steering. The grip went away because of the air coming off the machine in front of him, rather than because of anything he did with his hands. Halve a penalty for that many reasons, and you are most of the way to saying it should not exist. They stopped one step short, and they added no penalty points at all, which is the tell. Points are what the system uses to mark a driver as a repeat danger, and nobody attached that label here. So, on lap 8, following the racing line into the corner is a defense. On lap 1, losing the front end for a fraction of a second in dirty air is not. Just when Ferrari might have expected to sit quietly and enjoy a podium, their own team principal walks straight into the argument on the other side. Fred Vasseur calls the Hamilton penalty mega harsh, points out that Russell had space to his left and was nowhere near the wall, and then makes the observation that really stings. Every opening lap incident this season has been treated as a racing incident. Every one. Until this one. Toto Wolff, whose driver is the one sitting in the gravel, does not push for punishment either. His read is that Russell went for the outside on late braking, and it should have been his corner, and that what followed was a racing incident. Russell himself, the driver who lost the entire afternoon, says he does not think Hamilton should have been penalised, that the blame sits more with Hamilton, but that nothing about it was rash. Brundle called it a racing incident live on air. Take a moment with that. The penalised driver, the team that got hit, the team boss of the man who benefited from the other decision, and the most respected voice in the commentary box all land in the same place. The punishment is the outlier, not the contact. Hamilton's own summary is 4 words long: racing incident. And it is what it is. That is not a season simmering. It is a season boiling over. None of this appears out of nowhere. The reason this meeting exists at all is that the grid spent last year making the same complaint in slower motion, and the sport built a process to absorb it rather than fix it. At the end of last season, the drivers and the stewards sat down in Qatar to go through the year's most disputed calls, one by one, on the record. The presentation they were given is the part worth holding on to. The chairman of the stewards laid out data, showing that only 5 decisions across the entire season could reasonably be called controversial, a figure representing less than 1% of the incidents they handled. 5 case studies: Piastri and Antonelli in Brazil on an inside move, Sainz and Behrman at Monza on an outside move, Sainz and Lawson at Zandvoort in a long corner, Norris and Leclerc in Austin over track limits, Verstappen and Leclerc in Mexico over leaving the circuit. Look at what that list has in common: an inside move, an outside move, a long corner, track limits, and a driver leaving the circuit. 5 different geometries, 5 different tests, 5 different answers. One slide with the whole problem sitting on it. The sport does not have one rule about who owns a corner. It has a growing set of guidelines, each written for a particular kind of pass, and the outcome of any given incident depends on which of them an official reaches for first. Fewer than 1 in 100. Statistically, a rounding error. The trouble with a rounding error is that it does not feel like one when you are the driver inside it, and the drivers made that clear enough that the outcome of the meeting was an agreement to hold another one in the middle of this season, which is the room they are now walking into. The problem was never solved. It was scheduled. Enter Gary Connolly and the structure sitting behind him. Formula One does not employ a fixed panel of officials who see every race and build a consistent body of judgment. It uses a rotating group, drawn from a pool of around 12 individuals, with the faces changing from event to event. Connolly, as chairman of the stewards, has been the public voice defending that model and the numbers behind it. Russell has spent a long time arguing the other way, and he does it as a director of the Drivers' Association, not just as a Mercedes driver with a grievance. His position, shared by Carlos Sainz alongside him in that role, is that the sport needs permanent, salaried stewards, people who do this as a job, who see every incident of every season, and who therefore cannot produce 2 verdicts a week apart that read like they came from different institutions. The FIA has held the line so far. It prefers the rotating panel, while looking at an expanded role for the driver steward and at the idea of actually paying the people making these calls this year. Movement, but not the movement the grid asked for. The driver steward part deserves more attention than it gets. Every race weekend, one former competitor sits on the panel to provide the perspective of somebody who has actually been in the car at those speeds. Expanding that role is the compromise position, and it is the one most likely to survive contact with the governing body because it changes who is in the room without dismantling the rotating structure the FIA wants to protect. Whether it satisfies anyone is a different question. A driver steward who changes every event carries the same problem as everyone else on that panel. Nobody accumulates the memory of the season. Nobody has to explain, in October, why a ruling in July went the other way. What is not established yet is the fine print of the Budapest session. No day has been published, no time has been confirmed, and no official statement has come from the governing body about the meeting or what sits on its agenda. Nobody has named which drivers or which team principals intend to raise the Spa cases inside the room. What is known is that the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend runs from Friday to Sunday, with the race on Sunday, that driver media duties begin on Thursday, and that meetings of this type have historically been held on the Thursday of a race weekend. So the drivers walk in with a question, and underneath the question sits a single sentence in the rulebook that nobody in the paddock has been able to reconcile with the Leclerc verdict all week. Here it is. Under the International Sporting Code, any driver moving back toward the racing line, having earlier defended his position offline, should leave at least 1 car width between his own car and the edge of the track on the approach to the corner. 1 car width, not a suggestion about where the front axles are. A measurement of space on the approach to the corner for the driver who moves back across. Now hold that against what happened. Leclerc defends the inside down the Kemmel Straight with Piastri outside him. Leclerc then moves back left toward the racing line before the entry to Les Combes. The cars make contact. The argument the grid is carrying into Hungary is a short one. If the 2 of them touched, then a car width was not there. The contact is the evidence, and the stewards cleared it using a completely different test. The front axle standard, the question of whether an overtaking driver has enough of the car ahead to have earned the corner, is guidance built for a driver going around the outside at the apex, deciding who owns the space through the turn itself. Spa's Les Combes braking zone is not that. It is a straight line, at enormous speed, with the squeeze happening before anyone turns in. Apply an apex rule to a braking zone, and you get a verdict that sounds airtight on paper and makes no sense to the 20 people who actually have to drive it. So there is the case. And it is a case, not a proven fact, because the officials do not accept the comparison at all. Their position is that the two incidents were of a totally different nature, which is why they were handled differently. One was a defending driver taking his line. One was a driver who lost the front end and could not hold his car. Nothing inconsistent about it. In their reading, the grid does not buy it. That is the collision that actually matters this weekend, and it does not happen on a circuit. So what changes? Realistically, nobody walks out of a room in Budapest with the sporting code rewritten, and the two Spa verdicts are final either way. Penalties do not get handed back, and podiums do not get redistributed because a meeting went badly. What can come out of it is wording, a clarification bulletin, an update to the driving standards guidelines, a line making it explicit which test applies in a braking zone and which one applies at an apex. That sounds like paperwork. It is not. It is the difference between a driver knowing he can hold his line to the paint and a driver knowing he has to leave a car width, and it decides how the next 50 of these are raced rather than argued. The venue makes the timing sharper still. Whatever gets said inside that room, the grid walks straight back out of it and goes racing at the Hungaroring on the same weekend. Two cars arriving at a braking zone side by side, one on the inside, one hanging on around the outside, is the single most likely image of Sunday. Whichever way they read that moment, they will be reading it with a fresh ruling in their heads and no clarification underneath it. The conversation comes first. Days later, on track, comes the test. And the alternative is the one Piastri already described. If the squeeze carries no consequence at all, not even a warning flag, then the incentive runs the wrong way. Every defending driver learns that the bare minimum is the correct amount of space to leave, and every attacking driver learns to expect it. At most circuits, that produces a run across a curb and a lot of shouting on the radio. On the exit of the Kemmel Straight into Les Combes, with both cars still traveling at the speeds they carry through there, Stella's warning about a crash nobody controls stops being theoretical. There is one more thread running underneath all of this, and it involves the driver who was not investigated for anything. Verstappen is in the Hamilton ruling by name because it is the turbulent air from his Red Bull that the stewards accept caused the front end to let go in the first place. He is also the loudest critic the current rules package has, unhappy enough with the new engines that he spent his Spa weekend comparing the power available through Sector 2 to what a Formula 3 car makes, only with Formula 1 downforce underneath it. The comparison is rhetorical rather than literal. The mood behind it is not. So the sport arrives in Hungary, with drivers unhappy about how the cars feel, unhappy about how the rules are applied, and finally in the same room as the people who apply them. The stewards say the two incidents were of a totally different nature. The drivers spent all week pointing at the same corner, the same braking zone, and the same weekend, and asking which part of that is different. Neither side has moved. What happens in Budapest decides whether anyone does. Watch what the FIA publishes after that meeting, rather than what anyone says walking out of it. A guidelines update tells you the grid won. Silence tells you the file is closed, and the next Les Combes is already on its way.